Good evening, everyone. I, Rishika Multani, feel glad to welcome you all here in the session of Second Orange City Literature Fest by SGR Knowledge Foundation. The session will be of 40 minutes from 5 p.m. to 5:40 p.m. Our topic for this session is 1991, How P.V. Narasimha Rao Made History by our guest speaker Sanjaya Baru sir, and we have our moderator Dr. Vinay Nalwa ma'am. A writer, policy analyst, and economist, Sanjaya Sir is Distinguished Fellow, Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and United Service Institution of India. He has been the editor of India's major financial newspapers, The Economic Times, Financial Express, and Business Standard. He was media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy, International Institute of Strategic Studies, London. He was Professor of Economics at University of Hyderabad, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, and Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Singapore. He was Secretary General, Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. He was member of India's National Security Advisor Board in 1991 to 2001 and member of Governing Board of Centre for Policy Research. He is founder trustee, Forum for National Security Studies, India. Some of his publications include Strategic Consequences of India's Economic Rise, The Accidental Prime Minister, The Making and Unmaking of Manmohan Singh, and 1991, How P.V. Narasimha Rao Made History and the Bombay Plan, a Blueprint for Economic Research since 2018. Our moderator, Dr. Vinay Nalwa ma'am, is an author and a columnist. She has a master's degree in social work and a PhD in sociology. She has worked extensively on gender-specific mental health issues also. She has also written extensively on various socio-political issues on major media platforms. She has co-authored the book Ram Janmabhoomi, Truth, Evidence, Faith. Her forthcoming book is on the Inquisition and Liberation of Goa. He is a senior fellow with Delhi-based think tank Vichar Vinimay Kendra. Handing over the session to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rishika. Dr. Sanjay Baru, he's a multifaceted personality. He's an author, economist, commentator, and academician. And he was media advisor to the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. And his book, The Accidental Prime Minister, has been one of the most talked about in the recent past. And today we are going to discuss one of his insightful works titled 1991, How P.V. Narasimha Rao Made History. I thank you, Dr. Baru, for being with us. And let me start by asking you, since you have called Dr. Manmohan Singh and P.V. Narasimha Rao accidental Prime Minister, so what do you think is the similarity between the two? And how do you think we can, differentiate in terms of taking policy decisions? So can you please elaborate on that?
Well, I think the one similarity is that neither expected to be prime minister till the day they became prime minister. Okay. Unlike, let's say, many other, for example, Mr. Narendra Modi contested an election for the Lok Sabha in 2014, hoping to become prime minister. Similarly, Atalji contested an election hoping to become prime minister, or even Rajiv Gandhi or Indira Gandhi. They're all, preparing themselves for a position which they expected or hoped to have. But neither Narasimha Rao ji nor Dr. Singh were actually expecting to become prime ministers. And so I think the two of them, in that sense, were accidental for two different reasons. In the case of Mr. Narasimha Rao, the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi created the context for his becoming prime minister. And in the case of Dr. Singh, the fact that the Congress could not form a government on its own and required a coalition, and coalition partners were opposed to Sonia Gandhi becoming prime minister, meant that they had to find somebody acceptable to Sonia Gandhi and acceptable to other coalition partners like Karunanidhi, Sharad Pawar, Lalu, and the left. And Manmohan Singh was the one person that everybody was willing to accept. So that's the reason why that's the similarity between the two. Incidentally, even in the case of Mr. Narasimha Rao, he was someone who everybody was willing to accept because he was contesting uh, against Sharad Pawar and Arjun Singh, the two main rivals. And while Pawar had support in Maharashtra and Arjun Singh had support in Madhya Pradesh, neither of them was able to find much support outside their state, and Narasimha Rao was able to do that. So, in a sense, both were accidental. At the same time, both were consensual prime ministers. Your second question was, sorry, I didn't get the second question. What was that? Sorry, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah,
you're on mute.
yeah. I was asking about the difference in spite of having similarity by how you have defined it. What is the basic difference between these two in terms of
Yeah.
policies and the whole situation, the crisis? Both have faced crisis in party and outside the party also. So, what was the difference?
Well, the fundamental difference, of course, is that Narasimha Rao was a lifelong politician and Manmohan Singh was not. And I
Right.
think that in many ways defined their very different personalities. It's not true that both faced a crisis. I mean, 1991, both faced a crisis. But in 2004, when Manmohan Singh became prime minister, the country was on a fairly good wicket. He did not have too many problems to handle. But what is interesting is that both of them had a focus both on the economy and on foreign policy. One of the points I make in my book 1991 is that Narasimha Rao's tenure, people think of 91 only as a year in which economic reforms were introduced or liberalization was taking place. It was also the year in which the Cold War ended. It was in the year in which India had to reorient its foreign policies. And certainly Manmohan Singh as prime minister will always be remembered for the nuclear deal. So he will
Right.
also be remembered for his economic policy. So, that's the kind of commonality as well as the difference.
Okay. So you were talking about the foreign policy. So according to you, what made Narasimha Rao establish diplomatic relations with Israel? As it went against the Congress' long-standing policy, and there was also a risk of antagonizing a Muslim vote bank. So how do you see it?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting the way Narasimha Rao did the recognition of Israel, which was he first invited Yasser Arafat to come to India.
Right.
And gave him a fantastic reception and got himself photographed hugging Yasser Arafat and then explained to Yasser Arafat the reason why India was going to recognize Israel. And don't forget that by 91, Egypt, which was another Arab country, had already recognized Israel. And so I think Narasimha Rao's point to Yasser Arafat was that we have our own compulsions and we are going to do this. And once he got Arafat's support, he went ahead and did this. So, in a sense, he did not antagonize the Arab world by recognizing Israel. They were domestic concerns. But, the fact is that the context of 91, when on the one hand he recognized Israel, and on the other hand he strengthened our diplomatic relations with countries like Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. The context was really the end of the Cold War. The world had entered a new phase. India's foreign policy from the time of Jawaharlal Nehru from 1947 till 1990 was defined in the context of the Cold War. And we pursued what were called the policy of non-alignment between the two major powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But in 91, the Soviet Union was disappearing because it disappeared at the end of 91, in December 91. But it was already very clear through the year that the Soviet Union was in a crisis. And I think, therefore, Narasimha Rao understood, as someone who had already been a foreign minister, don't forget he was the foreign minister under Rajiv Gandhi and under Indira Gandhi. So he understood that the world was changing and India had to change accordingly. So I think the new bilateral relationships, whether it's recognition of Israel or enhancing the diplomatic relations with Korea, all of that was done keeping in mind the fact that America had emerged as as the single most powerful nation in the world, and India had to establish a new equilibrium with the United States.
Okay, that was interesting. And I think you have mentioned in the book that almost a decade of mismanagement of economy led to 1991 economic crisis. So, what went wrong with the policies of during the time of Rajiv Gandhi and the subsequent governments till 1991?
The fact is that ever since countries to the east of India started doing much better than India, which is the ASEAN economies, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, then also the East Asian economies, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and finally even China, which opened up in 1979. When all these East Asian economies started growing faster and becoming more and more industrialized, there was already a lot of concern in India that we were lagging behind and we had to change our economic policies. And between 1980 and 90, in that decade, several reports have been produced during Indiraji's tenure, during Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, suggesting a wide range of policy changes. But neither of them had the political kind of conviction to actually implement many of these policy changes. The second thing that happened in the 80s, particularly after Rajiv Gandhi became prime minister, was a sudden increase in spending. I mean, Rajiv Gandhi had 400 MPs in parliament. He had absolute majority in parliament. So, he just did what he liked. Government increased, tremendous increase in government spending, as a result of which the fiscal deficits began to rise. And if you read the economic surveys written even when he was prime minister in 1987, 88, 89, they were all drawing attention to the fact that the economy was, fiscal policy was going out of control, that this would result in inflation, that it increasing India's debt, and not just domestic debt, but also external debt. So all these problems were mounting, and it became clear by 1989 that a lot of changes had to take place in the economy. Now, if actually in 89, either Rajiv Gandhi himself or subsequently VP Singh had undertaken policy reform, we would not have seen the crisis of 91. But unfortunately, the two governments we got under the prime ministership of both VP Singh and then Chandrasekhar were very short lived. I mean, each of them had virtually 1 year in office. They did not have majority in parliament, and they were not able to get through a lot of policy changes that were required. Plus, there was a lot of resistance even within the Congress at that time. Rajiv Gandhi was not willing to allow not willing to allow Chandrasekhar, whose government was dependent on Congress support, to undertake some of the policy changes. So things were getting worse from 88, 89, 90. And then in 90 came the big shock, which was the oil shock. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, oil prices shot up, and that resulted in a huge dent on our foreign exchange reserves. So it's an accumulation of all these problems, but essentially the fiscal mismanagement of the second half of the 80s under two successive prime ministers, both Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh, and the inability of Chandrasekhar to actually turn the economy around because he did not have the numbers in parliament. That forced the economy into a crisis. And 91, then Narasimha Rao had no option but to in fact undertake a major loan program from the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF said that they would not give you money unless you undertook reforms. So in a sense, the reform was also forced on us.
Okay. When you were explaining about PV Narasimha Rao, you said he sort of resolved the economic situation, the economic crisis. And at many fronts, he was successful in getting, a country out of the difficult situations. But was he successful? What was it that, he was not able to resolve the Ram Janmabhoomi issue? So what do you think went wrong? He has the power, the willpower to, and his negotiating skills were quite praiseworthy. So what do you think? What went wrong?
Before I come to the Ram Janmabhoomi issue, I think I should clarify to those who are hearing that the reforms of 91 had three very different elements.
Okay.
The fiscal adjustment, that is reducing fiscal deficit sharply and getting government finances under control, was a policy change that had to be done to account for all the problems which I've already mentioned, which is essentially fiscal mismanagement. But along with the fiscal adjustment, Narasimha Rao undertook two further interventions, which actually are the real reform, what we call reform or liberalization. One was tariff reduction, trade reform. India had very, very high rates of tariffs. I think we had something like peak tariffs of 300% on a variety of goods, but the average tariff rate was more than 120%. And that was sharply brought down to two digits by in July 91. The second important reform that he undertook was the industrial policy reform. We had what was called a license permit Raj. You could not set up a factory without getting a license from the government of India. So government of India basically controlled all industrial activity across the country. People, whether you are in Tamil Nadu or in Kashmir or in Assam, you have to come to Delhi, lobby with politicians in Delhi, with joint secretaries in the ministries to get permission to start an industry. And that, all of that ended just overnight when the entire industrial policy, licensing policy system was overthrown. So I think it's important to understand what happened in 91 was not just fiscal reform, but also trade liberalization and industrial policy reform. Now, coming to your question, so important question, how come a guy who was able to do such important things in the economic field as well as in the foreign policy field was not able to resolve the Ram Janmabhoomi issue? Well, frankly, he tried. He tried right through the year 91 to see if he could resolve the issue. He had, in his Prime Minister's office, a gentleman called PVRK Prasad, who had been the executive director for the Tirupati temple and one of the most successful executive directors for the Tirupati temple, who modernized the Tirupati temple. I mean, those who have been to Tirupati in the last 25 years would have seen the kind of infrastructure developed in Tirupati, which you don't have even today in, let's say, Kashi Vishwanath in Varanasi or many of the other famous temples of the country. But Tirupati is very modern and run in a very corporate lines. And the man who did all of that was a gentleman called PVRK Prasad, who had been Narasimha Rao's secretary when he was chief minister in Andhra Pradesh in 1971-72. And Prasad had fantastic personal equation with a lot of religious leaders across the country because of what he did in Tirupati. He knew a lot of all the Shankaracharyas. He knew a lot of the other, leaders of Hindu faith. And so Narasimha Rao thought he could use him to see if he could get all of them to come to a settlement. And he tried to persuade the various Mathadipatis and various heads of orders, Hindu orders, to see if they could arrive at a compromise. But clearly, the issue was not just religious, it was political, because the BJP was using the Rama Janmabhoomi issue to build its own political base. And therefore, they were not willing to accept any kind of a compromise. And finally, when there was this December 2nd event of 1992, Narasimha Rao was assured by the BJP leadership, including Kalyan Singh, who was the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, that they would not allow the actual demolition of the mosque. That there would be, gathering of people. There would be some kind of event, but that they would not actually destroy the pre-existing structure. And therefore, he believed in the state government. And as you know, in a federal system, an elected state government has the powers to deal with law and order. It was a law and order issue, and so he left it to them. Now, there were some people in the Congress party who wanted the state government to be dismissed. Now, that was the kind of federalism that Indira Gandhi practiced, where the center would simply dismiss state governments. And Narasimha Rao was not willing to dismiss the Kalyan Singh government. It had enjoyed the majority in the assembly. So I think the fact is that what happened on 2nd December 1992 was something which certainly Narasimha Rao did not expect. But now we know that even someone like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and L.K. Advani, many of them did not expect. I mean, we have now a new book on Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Advani written by Vinay Sitapati, who wrote the biography of P.V. Narasimha Rao, Half Lion. And Vinay Sitapati has now written a book called Jugal Bandi on the Advani-Vajpayee relationship. And it's very clear from all these records that even the BJP leadership did not actually expect the mosque there to be destroyed.
Right.
And when it started happening, the cabinet met, but nobody recommended president's rule. So Narasimha Rao's defense has been that, look, I allowed the state government to manage the situation. They fouled it up. And, we are left with holding the baby.
Right. At least like now we can say by Supreme Court's order, the things are settled. These things have settled to an extent.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. Now, there are many commentators and observers, as well as the section of Congress leaders, who have criticized the elitist style of functioning of the present government leadership. And in your book also, you have mentioned about it. So, what do you think? Do you think the seeds of this malady, of this style of functioning, where the top high command whip is everything, do you think it is the seeds of this behavior was sown during Rajiv Gandhi's regime?
No, I mean, after all, it was Indira Gandhi who imposed the emergency. We had a formal kind of dictatorial regime during the emergency under Indira Gandhi. And actually, Rajiv Gandhi, as I said, despite having more than 400 MPs in parliament, was not such an authoritarian prime minister, though he had, as you say, a very elitist kind of government in terms of the kind of people around him. They were called whiz kids of Rajiv Gandhi, and they went to Doon School in Dehradun and Oxford and Cambridge. So it was a very elitist social class that was around Rajiv. But the fact is that his government was not as authoritarian as Indira Gandhi's was during the emergency. I think the criticism with Mr. Modi's government is that in many ways, like Indira Gandhi's government, it's a highly centralized government. Everything happens in the Prime Minister's office. Individual ministers, cabinet ministers do not have the kind of power and authority that even under Indira, many of her colleagues enjoyed. I mean, after all, during Mrs. Gandhi's time, not during the emergency, but before and then in the period after 80, you had very senior politicians who were union ministers who had a independent standing. And I think today there's a feeling that, whether it's Mr. Rajnath Singh in defense or Nitin Gadkari, they're all senior politicians, former presidents of the party, that their voice is not adequately heard, that it's a government run by two individuals. So that is the kind of criticism that one reads about a centralized way of functioning of this government. But, that is what has happened to so many political parties, highly centralized. In many states, the chief ministers have become, like American president. We have a presidential system, except that even in the American system, the Congress has a lot of powers. There's a division of powers between the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. And I think in India right now, what we are seeing is excessive overload of power in the executive, a judiciary that is come under a lot of criticism. After a long time, we are seeing this kind of, during the emergency or after the emergency, we saw a lot of criticism of the judiciary. But now, for the first time, we are seeing a tremendous amount of criticism of the functioning of the judiciary. And of course, Parliament, has become, the opposition is hardly there.
Okay, so a lot of criticism also tells that democracy is working finely.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, see, one thing, we are a very pluralistic people. The joke used to be, if you have two Indians, there are three opinions, right?
Right, right.
So that is how we are. That is how we are. And I think that is our strength. Many think that is our weakness, but no, that is our strength. We are a, a pluralistic minded people, and therefore it's not easy. But nevertheless, there is centralization of the way in which the executive has functioned.
Yeah, but the Congress leadership has always actually, in within the party there is centralization. Uh, we cannot. Government is another matter, but within the party, if there is the leadership is everything. Like if they have to decide, if they have to take all the decisions, and during the Rajiv Gandhi regime or during his tenure, you see that the grassroots there was a there was a differentiation, there was a distance was created between the grassroots level workers and the party high command or the top leaders of the party. So
So let me,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
please.
So let me come back to my book, because we are talking about my book here.
Yes.
And this is one of the issues that I'd actually discuss in my book, which is the way in which Narasimha Rao, after 20 years, conducted party elections. The last time the Congress party had elections were in the early 70s, or probably 69 or 71. And through the 70s and 80s, the party didn't have election. As you know, as you correctly said, I mean, it was highly centralized. Once Indira Gandhi passed away, Rajiv Gandhi was made a prime minister. There was no formal election, etc. And that state of affairs was actually sought to be changed by Narasimha Rao in 1992, when he convened the AICC session at Tirupati. And at the Tirupati AICC, they had elections to the Congress Working Committee. He tried to revitalize the Congress party. Of course, it's a different matter that he felt that the elections were, did not favor or did not allow a Dalit to be elected, a woman to be elected. So, because in the CWC there was no Dalit, no woman, he said, let all those who got elected resign, and then I will nominate a Dalit and I will nominate a woman, and therefore he kind of nominated others as well. So, in a sense, the effort of conducting elections was to an extent kind of neutralized by this strategy that he used to actually control the party. And of course, he remained the president of the party, and he understood that in the Congress, unless the president is also prime minister or the prime minister is also president, you cannot run the party efficiently. But the fact is that 1992, you had organized national elections. And one of the demands being made now in the Congress party for the last 1 year is that it should again have organizational elections.
Right.
That Rahul Gandhi became president without a proper organizational election, and now there is a demand for organizational elections. So it's true. I think the contribution of Narasimha Rao, earlier I had mentioned, is economic policy and foreign policy. But what my book discusses is also his political contribution. And I think the significance of his 5 year tenure was it showed to the Congress party for the first time after independence that a non Nehru Gandhi person can run a Congress government. Because from 47 till 89, with the brief interlude of Lal Bahadur Shastri, you had three members of the Nehru Gandhi family who were prime ministers of India. And a feeling had emerged that only that family can run the country. And I
Right.
think what Narasimha Rao showed was that he could actually, as a normal congressman, I mean, he was not a major independent leader in the way in which, for example, someone like Y.B. Chavan or Mohanlal Sukhadia or Brahmananda Reddy, these are all very powerful regional leaders. But Narasimha Rao was not. And yet, as an ordinary congressman, he was able to run a government for 5 years. And I think that was an important political lesson coming out of his tenure, and which I talk about in my book.
And you have also mentioned that he was thinking of retiring in 1991, like after his term.
That was in before he became prime minister. I mean, he had actually packed his books, which were sent away to Hyderabad, where he had got a house. He was going to live in Hyderabad. He set up the foundation in the name of his guru. Ramanand Tirth was his guru, and he set up the Ramanand Tirth Foundation, which he was going to run as a think tank. And he was also invited by a temple in Tamil Nadu to come and be a pujari there, which he had accepted. So he was going to run a think tank in Hyderabad and be a pujari in a temple. And he was on his way out when suddenly Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated and the party decided to make him the president and subsequently the prime minister.
Right. There is another question that comes to my mind is that in 1991, we witnessed India ushering in liberalization and globalization. And in today, the economic front you know about, we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. So is this, in this paradigm shift, is it good for India or is it bad?
You see, I don't have any problem with the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat. I mean, after all, we are a large country of 1.3 billion people. It's a huge landmass. We have the potential, like China, to emerge as a major economy. I think the question really is what policy instruments will you use? And one important change that happened in 91 was trade liberalization and a focus on becoming more integrated with the global economy. Recently, there's a paper by Arvind Subramanian, who used to be a former chief economic advisor, that shows how exports contributed handsomely to India's growth after 91. And the fact that India's share of world trade increased from 0.5% in 1990 to more than 2% by 2010 over a 20-year period showed that India had become globally more competitive. The share of trade in our national income increased from less than 20% in 1990 to more than 50% by 2015. So we had become a large trading economy. We had free trade agreements with several countries. And the world was thinking of India like it thought of China as a globally competitive economy. I think part of the problem today is that people are confused. You know, the Atmanirbhar slogan has confused people. Is it that India is saying we are doing whatever we are doing to become even more globally competitive and that we will continue to be integrated? Or are we saying we are closing our doors? And I think the Prime Minister has tried to clarify, but these doubts continue. If you read literature around the world, there are a lot of questions being raised about the direction of our trade policy. We have said that China has hurt us, which is correct. The huge trade deficit with China is a major problem. But we have been criticizing all free trade agreements, even with friendly countries like Korea, with Japan, with ASEAN. So there's a question mark about the direction. And I think the government has to further clarify what exactly it means by Atmanirbharta. What does it mean with his industrial policy? If it means strengthening the economy and making India globally more competitive, that should be welcomed.
Okay. I think that makes us come to the last question. Though you have answered it in parts, the question is if you have to single out the biggest achievement and the biggest failure of a former prime minister, what do you think would they be?
Well, certainly his biggest achievement was what he did in his first year. I think that is why the 1991 is so important because it defined Narasimha Rao's leadership.
Yes.
And I guess his biggest failure, like for any politician, defeat is failures, right? So the fact that he couldn't get a second term in 96, in my judgment. I mean, people say 92, Babri Masjid was his biggest failure, but I don't put the full blame on him. I think there's several factors that contributed to what happened in that. So, in a sense, his personal failure was his inability to come back to power in 95, in 96. That's it.
Okay. It was a privilege talking to you, and I thank you once again. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful session. On behalf of Orange City Literature Fest and SGR Knowledge Foundation, we sincerely express our gratitude towards your acceptance for this session and knowledge shared with us. I would also like to thank our radio partner 92.7 Big FM for their support.
Okay.
Our next session is Let's Talk About Creating a Bestseller at 6 p.m.
20 years of existence. 2 universities. 23 educational institutes. Offering 137 courses. Raisoni Group of Institutions. A vision beyond.